In the complex and dangerous universe of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, fear was a tool, a currency, and a constant companion. He learned to navigate the fear of the law, to negotiate with the fear of the Mafia, and to wield the fear he inspired as a scepter of power. He faced men who could order his death with a nod, and prosecutors who could bury him under a mountain of charges. Yet, the fear these adversaries inspired was predictable, a matter of calculation and risk. There was, however, a deeper, more primal and far more personal form of dread that inhabited the psyche of the Godfather of Harlem. It wasn't the fear of a bullet or a prison cell. It was the paralyzing fear of the disapproval of a single person, a woman whose intelligence he revered, whose authority he recognized as absolute, and whose judgment was the only one he couldn't bear to fail. This woman was not his beloved wife, Mamie, but the architect of his world, the sovereign queen who taught him the game, Madame Stephanie St. Clair. To understand the singular nature of Bumpy's fear, one must go back in time to the end of the tumultuous 1930s. Harlem was still healing from the open wounds of the Great Depression, a place of vibrant culture and profound economic hardship. Prohibition had ended, but the city's thirst for vice remained insatiable, and the numbers game, an illegal but immensely popular lottery, had become the lifeblood of the neighborhood's underground economy. In this setting, a young Bumpy Johnson was already a force to be reckoned with. His sharp strategic mind, combined with steely courage, set him apart as an exceptional talent. However, he was not yet the monarch. He was a prince in court, the chief enforcer and most trusted lieutenant in someone else's thriving empire. The throne unquestionably belonged to Madame St. Clair, the queen of numbers, the woman who had confronted and defeated the brutal gangster Dutch Schultz and now ruled Harlem with an iron fist in a velvet glove. The rise of Stephanie St. Clair is one of the most extraordinary and underrated sagas in American crime history. Arriving in New York as an immigrant from Martinique, with little more than her sharp intellect and an uncompromising refusal to be subjugated, she navigated the treacherous waters of a world dominated by white men. She didn't just survive, she thrived. With a genius for mathematics and a deep understanding of her community's psychology, she transformed a series of small-scale operations into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. She confronted the brutality of gangster Dutch Schultz, who attempted to seize her territory by force, waging a bloody and costly war on the streets. More than just a criminal, St. Clair was a fierce activist, using her wealth and influence to publicly fight police brutality and corruption, buying full-page ads in Harlem newspapers to expose the police officers who harassed her, an act of defiance unthinkable at the time. St. Clair's power did not reside solely in her wealth or the loyalty of her armed enforcers. It emanated from a much deeper source, the respect and gratitude of the Harlem community itself. She employed thousands as number bankers, runners, and accountants, offering a path to economic stability at a time when employment opportunities for black people were severely limited. She was known for her generosity, helping families pay rent, funding scholarships, and supporting local businesses. She understood that her empire was not merely a criminal operation, it was a social institution. In return for this protection and patronage, the community offered her unwavering loyalty, serving as her eyes and ears, shielding her operations from outsiders, and providing an impenetrable wall of silence against police investigations. St. Clair not only ruled Harlem, she embodied its resilience and defiant spirit, becoming a figure of power and pride for her people. It was in this environment that a young Bumpy Johnson found his mentor. St. Clair, with her keen eye for talent, saw in Bumpy a reflection of herself, a strategic mind hidden behind a tough facade, a fierce ambition tempered by an instinctive understanding of the streets. She took him under her wing, not just as an employee but as a protégé. She taught him the subtle art of power, the lessons that couldn't be learned in backroom fights. She taught him that violence was a crude tool, to be used sparingly, while information, influence, and financial control were the true weapons of a king or queen. Bumpy absorbed every lesson, his admiration for her bordering on veneration. He studied her methods, her ability to balance ferocity and diplomacy, her understanding that community loyalty was the ultimate fortress. She gave him more than a job. She gave him an education in real power. As Bumpy matured under St. Clair's tutelage, his own reputation began to grow exponentially. As her chief enforcer, he was the physical manifestation of her will, the iron fist protecting her kingdom. He led his men into battles against rival gangs and repelled early Mafia incursions. His courage was legendary, his tactical mind unquestionable. However, with increasing power came increased self-confidence. The line between loyalty to his mentor and his own growing ambition began to blur. He began to see himself not only as the guardian of the throne, but as its rightful and inevitable heir. In his mind, he was becoming a master of the game in his own right. This growing self-perception, though natural, contained the seeds of a dangerous miscalculation, a moment of youthful arrogance in which the protégé would believe just for an instant that he could outsmart the queen who had taught him to play. The catalyst for Bumpy's mistake came in the form of a seemingly lucrative business opportunity. In the aftermath of the war with Dutch Schultz, the underworld was in a state of flux, with territories being renegotiated. A small but ambitious Italian syndicate, wary of provoking direct conflict with the St. Clair Empire, approached Bumpy with a proposal. They wanted permission to operate a small gambling business in a fringe of Harlem territory, an area notoriously difficult to control. In return, they would offer Bumpy a significant fixed percentage of the profits, a substantial payment that would represent a clean and easy revenue stream. The offer struck directly at Bumpy's pride. He saw it as a chance to demonstrate his own skill as a negotiator and strategist, to prove that he could expand the empire on his own. Driven by a mixture of ambition and a desire to impress his mentor, Bumpy made a fateful decision. He accepted the offer and closed the deal without consulting Stephanie St. Clair. He justified himself, believing he was acting in the best interest of the business, taking an initiative that she, preoccupied with larger matters, would appreciate. He presented himself to the Italians as the decision-maker, the man whose word was law in the streets. After the details were settled and the first payment made, he prepared to present his accomplishment to St. Clair, expecting praise for his shrewdness and audacity. He imagined her approval, perhaps a rare smile, and an acknowledgement that her protégé had become a master. He couldn't have been more wrong. The news he received in return was not congratulations, but a cold, emotionless summons to her office the following morning. At that simple command, Bumpy felt the first chill of a fear he hadn't felt in a long time. Stephanie St. Clair's office on prestigious Edgecombe Avenue was a physical manifestation of her power and sophistication. Unlike the damp, smoky hideouts of other crime bosses, her workspace was elegant and airy, more like the drawing room of a Parisian diplomat. Original works of art, acquired on her travels, adorned the silk-lined walls. Expensive oriental rugs muffled the sound of footsteps on the polished floor. A large, gleaming mahogany desk dominated the room, but instead of accounting books and weapons, it was adorned with international newspapers, poetry books, and a single vase with a fresh orchid. The air was perfumed not with the smell of cheap beer, but with the subtle aroma of her imported French tobacco. The entire environment was designed to intimidate, not through the threat of violence, but through an overwhelming aura of intellectual and cultural superiority. It was a reminder that she wasn't just a gangster, she was of a completely different class. Upon entering the office, Bumpy felt the shift in the atmosphere like a drop in barometric pressure. St. Clair sat behind her desk, not looking at him, but reading a newspaper. She didn't invite him to sit down. She simply left him standing in the middle of the room in silence. The minutes dragged on, each tick of the pendulum clock on the wall amplified by the heavy silence. Bumpy felt his collar tighten, his carefully constructed confidence beginning to crumble under the weight of that deliberate silence. It was a power tactic she had taught him, and now it was being used against him with devastating effect. When she finally put down the newspaper, her gaze held no fire, but an icy disappointment that was infinitely worse. "Ellsworth," she said, her voice calm and controlled, the use of his formal name a subtle slap in the face. "Tell me, when did this become your empire to sell off in pieces?" Bumpy's defense kicked in immediately. He began explaining the rationale behind his decision, presenting the deal as a strategic masterstroke. He talked about the numbers, the the revenue stream, the low risk, and the benefit of having a foothold in enemy territory. He argued that the deal would strengthen their overall position, showing other unions that they could do business with them, but only on their terms. He painted a picture of himself as a proactive leader, securing the organization's future. As he spoke, he tried to read her expression, but St. Clair's face was an impassive mask. She let him lay out his entire argument, allowing him to build his own pedestal of business logic. She didn't interrupt him once, an act of patience that Bumpy would begin to realize was the calculated stillness of a predator waiting for its prey to become completely entangled in its own trap. When Bumpy finally finished his defense, the silence returned, heavier than before. St. Clair leaned back in her chair, bringing her fingertips together. She didn't attack his business logic. Instead, she launched into a series of questions, each a precise stab at his arrogance. "It was a good deal, you say," she began softly. "Did you consider how Mrs. Dubois, on 142nd Street, will feel seeing the men who killed her nephew over a $5 gambling debt now operating freely in her block with our blessing?" The question hit him like a blow. She continued, "And Reverend Powell, did you think of him? The man who fights every Sunday from his pulpit against the heroin that poisons our youth. You just gave the biggest Italian suppliers a base of operations 2 blocks from your church. You call that a good deal, Ellsworth?" With each question, St. Clair methodically dismantled the foundation of Bumpy's argument. She didn't talk about profits and losses, but about people, promises, and responsibilities. What about Pops Jefferson, the barber? He's been paying our protection for 15 years. He pays because he trusts we'll keep him safe, that we'll keep those same vultures away from his door. What do I tell him when those men come into his shop and demand a haircut, knowing we sanction them? She continued, naming merchants, community leaders, grieving mothers, weaving a vivid tapestry of the community that Bumpy, in his pursuit of a clever deal, had treated as an abstraction on a map. He hadn't just made a business deal, he had broken dozens of social pacts and betrayed the trust of the very people who constituted the true source of St. Clair's power. The moment of epiphany for Bumpy Johnson was excruciating and utter. Sweat beaded on his brow as the magnitude of his mistake overwhelmed him. He saw himself not as the brilliant strategist he imagined himself to be, but as an arrogant amateur. He had focused on the chess game of the underworld, on the movements of enemy pieces, and completely forgotten the board on which the game was played, Harlem itself. He realized that St. Clair's power did not come from her financial acumen or the strength of her enforcers, but from her encyclopedic knowledge and her genuine connection to the soul of the community. She didn't run a business, she ran a people. And in that moment, with a terror that chilled his blood, Bumpy understood that she could destroy him without firing a single shot. All she needed to do was whisper the truth of his betrayal to the right people, and he would become an outcast, powerless in his own territory. It was the first time he feared not death but complete and utter irrelevance. The punishment St. Clair decreed was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty and strategic genius. She could have killed him. She could have exiled him. Instead, she sentenced him to a humiliating re-education. "The deal is off," she stated categorically. "You yourself will cancel it. You will return their money, every penny, from your own pocket. And then, Ellsworth, you will take a month off from being a gangster." The sentence hung in the air. "You will not enter this office. You will not give a single order. Instead, you will walk. You will visit each of my number bankers on every corner. You will listen to their problems. You will go to Mrs. Dubois' house, pay your respects and apologize. You will sit in the back pew of Reverend Powell's church and listen to his sermons about the poison you almost invited. You will relearn this neighborhood you've forgotten, not from top to bottom but from the ground up. For a man of Bumpy's pride, the sentence was worse than any physical punishment. Being forced to admit his wrongdoing to the Italians was humiliating. Being forced to bow before the common people he had disregarded was an annihilation of his ego. Before dismissing him, St. Clair picked up a small book from her desk. It was a volume of poetry by Paul Laurence Dunbar, a poet who wrote eloquently about the black experience in America. She opened it to a page marked with a ribbon bookmark and pushed it toward him. "Read the poem We Wear the Mask," she told him, her voice finally carrying a trace of professorial warmth. You wear the mask of a leader, Ellsworth. It's time you understood what lies beneath. That final gesture cemented the lesson. It wasn't about criminal business. It was about identity, about understanding, and about the responsibility that comes with power. The book became a symbol of his greatest failing and his most crucial education. Bumpy Johnson accepted his punishment without a word. He left that office a different man, broken, but with his eyes open. He cancelled the deal with the Italians, enduring their insults and veiled threats, and then he began his penance. For a month he walked the streets of Harlem not as a boss, but as a student. He talked to shopkeepers, listened to the gossip in the barbershops, shared a drink with the dock workers. He sat in Mrs. Dubois' living room and listened to her story of pain. He felt the power in Reverend Powell's voice. He rediscovered the pulse of the neighborhood, not as a resource to be exploited, but as a community to be protected. Humiliation slowly gave way to understanding. St. Clair's lesson was brutal, but transformative. He learned that true loyalty cannot be bought or ordered. It must be earned day after day, through actions that demonstrate a genuine commitment to the well-being of the people. The impact of that encounter indelibly shaped the remainder of Bumpy Johnson's career. He emerged from his penance with a new philosophy of power, one that balanced the harshness of the underworld with a sense of civic responsibility. When, years later, Stephanie St. Clair retired from a life of crime, passing control of her vast empire into the capable hands of her protégé, Bumpy assumed the mantle not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. He maintained and expanded St. Clair's practices of community support, becoming known for his generosity as much as his ruthlessness. He became the godfather in the truest sense, a patriarch to his people. The fear he felt that day in her office, the fear of her disapproval, became his moral compass, the guide that prevented him from fully succumbing to the darkness of his world and transformed him from a mere gangster into a figure of historical stature. The story of Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson is, therefore, much more than a tale of crime. It is a parable about mentorship, power, and the transmission of wisdom. St. Clair was not a rival Bumpy outwitted, but the architect who designed the foundation of his reign. The fear he had of her was not the fear of an enemy, but the reverent fear of an acolyte for his high priestess, whose judgment was absolute. In a world where men measured their strength by their ability to inspire fear in others, Bumpy's strength was ultimately forged by the fear he had of disappointing the only person who saw not only the gangster he was, but the king he could become. She taught him the difference between controlling a territory and leading a people, a lesson that became the cornerstone of his enduring legend. The dynamic between them challenges simplistic underworld narratives. Such stories usually focus on succession through violence, the protégé killing the mentor to seize power. St. Clair's transition to Bumpy was the opposite. It was a planned abdication, a passing of the crown based on merit and readiness. St. Clair, being the consummate strategist she was, knew her reign had a deadline. Instead of clinging to power until the bitter end, she groomed her successor, testing and shaping him until he was ready to carry her legacy. The confrontation over the Italian deal wasn't a challenge to her authority, but Bumpy's ultimate test. By forcing him to confront his own arrogance and understand the true nature of power, she was ensuring that the empire she had so painstakingly built would survive and thrive under her leadership. Bumpy's fear, then, can be reinterpreted not as a weakness, but as a sign of his own wisdom. Foolish men do not fear the disapproval of their intellectual superiors. They resent them. Bumpy, even in his arrogance, was intelligent enough to recognize St. Clair's genius. His fear was not that of a coward, but that of a brilliant student who fears failing a final exam before a professor he immensely admires. It was a fear born of respect. This capacity to feel and respond to this kind of intellectual and moral fear is precisely what set him apart from cruder villains like Dutch Schultz. While Schultz saw St. Clair only as an obstacle to be crushed, Bumpy saw her as a standard to be reached, and it was this perspective that allowed him to inherit the kingdom instead of being destroyed by it. In retrospect, St. Clair's punishment was the greatest gift she could have given Bumpy. Violence would have hardened him, exile would have embittered him, but forced re-education deepened him. It forced him to develop empathy, to see the faces behind the numbers, to understand the human consequences of his business decisions. This empathy, combined with his innate ruthlessness, created a unique kind of leader, a warrior king philosopher. He could order a man's death before lunch and fund a breakfast program for underprivileged children afterward. This complexity, this ability to operate on multiple moral and social registers, is what made him so effective and so enduringly popular with his people. And this complexity was a direct gift, forged in the humiliating fire of his mentor's lesson. Thus, the legend of Bumpy Johnson is inseparable from the legend of Stephanie St. Clair. He is the moon whose brilliance, however powerful, is largely a reflection of the sun that gave it light. The woman he feared most was not a threat to his life, but to his soul, to his self-conception. By challenging him and then rebuilding him, she ensured that he became a worthy leader of the people of Harlem. Their story is a testament to the fact that true and lasting power is rarely self-created. It is almost always transmitted, a flame passed from one hand to another. And in the case of the Godfather of Harlem, the hand that passed him the torch was that of a queen, the only person in the world who could make him tremble, not with fear, but with profound and overwhelming respect.